If you love classic contemporary Christian music and the people that made it, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to help support us and keep us going. This is Stage Right, and I am your host, John Thorne. They say if you die with a handful of friends, you die a rich man. Well, I have several buses full, and I'm very excited to share them all with you. Welcome to Stage Right. I am your host, John Thorne. This is episode 32. So if you listen to the podcast live and in living color, you'll know this Sunday is Mother's Day. Now, in the past, I have sent my mom cards, and they're usually late. I'll send her a gift card, or I'll send her flowers. Those are easier to get there on time, but I'm not real good about getting stuff there early. Well, this year, I was ahead of the game. So I decided to get my mom for Mother's Day, instead of giving her 12 red roses, I decided to give her 12 red bottles of taco sauce. Now there's this taco sauce my family has eaten for like the last 45 years, and you can only get it certain places. We have a place in Michigan down the road that has it, but they don't have it anywhere in Alabama. So she had called me a couple weeks ago and said, hey, will you order me a case of that hot sauce? And I thought, well, with Mother's Day coming up, that's perfect. I'll just send her a case of taco sauce. So she called to tell me yesterday that the taco sauce arrived. And I said, well, happy Mother's Day. And she laughed and said, well, that's perfect. And I said, every time you have tacos in the next year, you sit down, you pour your sauce, and you just think to yourself, happy Mother's Day from John and Julie all over again. It's going to be the gift that keeps on giving. So this week alone, I wanted to let you know that we have listeners in the UK, Malaysia, Australia, South Africa, Norway, Canada, New Zealand, Poland, Slovakia, Belize, all over South America and Central America. Kind of crazy when you think about it.
Hey Rockstar provides digital marketing software and services to generate more leads, more exposure, and more revenue for your business or organization. Let Hey Rockstar amplify your awesomeness.
So not only is he one of the best musicians to ever play in contemporary Christian music, he's one of the most influential. Please welcome to the podcast today, Mr. Tim Smith from the Joe English Band. How are you doing, Tim?
John, thank you so much for asking me to be here. This is an honor.
The honor is mine. I can tell you, your story is so unique. I have to go back to the very beginning for you. Tell everyone where your musical influences were as a young kid.
Well, as I was born at a very young age in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was blessed from birth. My father was a man named Ralph Smith. My uncle, his brother, was named Arthur Smith, known best as Arthur Guitar Boogie Smith. They were raised in South Carolina in 1949. They had been doing radio and making records, but in 1949 they had an instrumental hit called Guitar Boogie, which sold 3 million copies and became the biggest selling instrumental of all time at that point.
Wow.
And in 1950, they moved to Charlotte because WBT in Charlotte had been granted a license to go from radio to add television. And they were going to be the orchestra on the television show. Back then, most of your big television stations had a built-in orchestra. And so the Arthur Smith and the Cracker Jacks became that orchestra. My dad was not only played accordion and banjo and everything else on it, but he's an amazing comedian, and so he was the voice of a lot of products, everything from Boston Bunny bread to Kent cigarettes. I mean, he was the voice of all those products. So, and because of their success and being really the first of their kind in the Carolinas, they ended up building a recording studio because they wanted to be able to record the music soundtracks for their weekly TV show. They were on TV 5 days a week in the mornings from 7 to 9.
Oh, my gosh.
And then they had a Thursday evening show that was coast-to-coast syndicated. And they wanted to be able to record the music first. They built a great studio in Charlotte. And because of that, for instance, in 1965, my Uncle Arthur produced James Brown's Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. We did all the anything that you ever heard George Beverly Shea sing on a Billy Graham crusade was probably written by my uncle or my dad or both.
Wow.
We had so much music in our home. My mother was incredibly supportive. I was the youngest of 4 kids. Was never forced to play music. There was instruments around the house, but somebody asked me how I got to be playing bass, and I think it was my 5th Christmas. My father gave me a guitar, and my brother Roddy, who is still my partner in all things music, it was 3 years older than me, and of course was bigger than me, and he picked up my guitar and could already push down the strings and play a chord, and I think I cried. And Roddy got the guitar, and about a week later, my dad walked in with a Hofner Beetle bass and a short scale bass. And,
Oh, wow.
He took the strings off the neck, took a piece of chalk, and wrote the names of the notes on the neck. And I knew my alphabet, and he would call out letters, and I would play them. And before you know it, I was playing bass.
That is remarkable.
Was so blessed. One of your questions, one of your comments, which is maybe the most honored thing that anybody's ever said to me, but in our house, you weren't allowed to only like one kind of music. My dad and my mom loved classical music. They loved show tunes. They loved country. They loved Elvis. They loved rock. They loved all that stuff. The only thing that my dad was not a huge bluegrass fan, and but he liked good bluegrass, but there was some of it he didn't like. But
Right.
I was never allowed to say, "Oh, I'm not going to play that."
Right.
And I can remember as I was getting older and trying to flex my own muscles a little bit. I was probably, I guess it must have been about 10 or 11 years old, and my brother and I asked our dad for a Jimi Hendrix record. And he came home with 2 records, a Jimi Hendrix record and the Best of Wes Montgomery, Volume 1, the great jazz guitar player. And he says, you can listen to the Jimi Hendrix record after you've listened to Wes Montgomery.
Wow, what guidance.
I think it was 2 weeks before we got to the Jimi Hendrix record. We were so enthralled by this genius of Wes Montgomery. So we had this incredibly supportive thing. And with a recording studio in the family, I mean, I was there watching from the time I was 4 or 5 years old. But as I got to be 12, 13 years old, I was able to go in with my brother and my cousin, and we would cut the machines on and start recording. And so it was always this creative playground for us.
That's remarkable.
But, through that, I got exposed to so many great people. I mean, from Roy Orbison, Ronnie Millsap, just all these people that would come do the TV show, Johnny Cash. We were around those people all the time, and it became the norm for me to be around them and to get to pick and make music with them. So it was just an incredible blessing. And I think one of the big changes in my life was when I got to high school in the 10th grade. I had a great band starting in the 8th or 9th grade with my classmates and with my brother. And I got to high school, and this girl that was one of my good friends came up to me one day and said her father was the band director. And this was at North Mecklenburg High School in Huntersville, North Carolina, just north of Charlotte. And she said, my dad wants you to come talk to him during lunch. So I went and talked to him, and he asked me if I would play guitar in the jazz band that he had. And I said, well, I'm not really a guitar player, but yeah, if you need me to, I'll try to do that. So I borrowed a guitar from my brother and went in and played. And after about a week, he said, can you read bass clef? And I said, oh, of course I can. I couldn't, had no idea what bass clef was, but I told him I could read bass clef. And I went home that weekend, and in one weekend, I sort of taught myself how to read bass clef and started playing bass in there at that point, and fell in love with all the big band music. And, that launched me into going to college for music. And I went to a school in the mountains of North Carolina called Appalachian State for 2 years. And while I was there, a lot of the professors there had gone to the University of Miami. And by great grace, I got to meet Jaco Pastorius, who was actually teaching at the University of Miami, but he was, and to this day, is probably the most influential bass player in history, and we became friends, and he paved the way for me to come to Miami, get a scholarship, go down and finish my undergrad work there, studied with him, studied with Don Kaufman, and started playing with some unbelievably brilliant people. You know, I was classmates with Bruce Hornsby and Ed Kaye, and just tons of people that have had very great careers. And I love playing jazz all of a sudden. And through that, and even with that, though, I never was willing to say, oh, well, jazz is superior to rock or jazz is superior to country. I mean, to me, the Allman Brothers were as great as John Coltrane. They were just different.
Right.
And so I was really blessed that I didn't have a jazz ego, which I call it, which enables a lot of jazz musicians to become very unpopular because
Right.
they think that everything they do is perfect and nobody else measures up to that.
Right.
By having all that experience in the studio, by the time I got to college in Miami, I had already played on hundreds of recording sessions.
Right.
And so I didn't know what I was going to do after college. My degree was called Studio Music and Jazz. And I thought, well, my heart is wanting to be a studio musician. And I decided to either move to New York, L.A., or Nashville. And my dad and my uncle were both on a Nashville label called Monument Records. And the founder was Fred Foster, who's the legendary guy that produced Roy Orbison and discovered Dolly Parton and Chris Christopherson, all those people. And Fred just came to me and said, if you'll move to Nashville, I'll use you on records.
Wow, that's cool.
And he was good to his word. I moved to Nashville. He got me an apartment. I went to his office. He made a phone call, and within 30 minutes, I was sitting in a room with Bill Justice, Chet Atkins, Owen Bradley, Fred, and 2 or 3 other great producers. And he just said, I want y'all to use Tim.
Oh, my gosh. How cool is that?
So Bill Justice that night called me and said, can you find the Sound Emporium? And I was like, yeah. So I got in the car. He said, bring a bass and a chord. I thought, okay. So I showed up at the studio with a bass and a chord, and I was the only one there. It was Bill Justice producing and the great Billy Sherrill engineering. And I played, he opens up this chart, and he said, can you play this? And I had been playing some really difficult music in Miami in college, and they opened this chart up, and the hardest thing on it was a dotted quarter to an eighth note. I said, yeah, I can play that. And so he mutes the bass track that was on the song and then turns me on, and I read the chart down. He goes, all right, let's record it. We did it. He goes, let's do another song. So we did a second song. And, of course, I can't hear any vocals. It's just rhythm track. And I said, well, who's the singer? And he pushes the fader up, and it's Tom Jones, and he was actually asleep on a couch in front of the console. And he raised up and said, that's my favorite singer. And I was like, oh, my gosh.
Tom Jones.
I like Nashville. This is going to be great. But the next set of tracking dates I did for Fred was for a guy named Arthur Hancock, who owned a string of racehorses, including Native Dancer and some other Kentucky Derby winning racehorses from Kentucky. And he's a great songwriter. And on those sessions, it was me on bass, Gene Crispin on drums, Reggie Young on electric guitar, Ray Eddington on acoustic guitar, Charlie McCoy on harmonica, Buddy Spiker on fiddle, Lloyd Green on steel guitar. And, you know, I'm looking around the room, and these are legendary recording musicians. And right. I got finished with the first song, and Reggie Young, who was the all-time guitar hero here, walked over, shook my hand, and said, welcome. And I thought, well, I guess I can die happy now at 23 years old. You know, it was I was in the club, and I was just so proud that the skills that I'd learned along the way from my childhood. If I had just come out of college, I would not have known how to do it. I didn't read the Nashville. I had already learned how to read the number system, and right. But just really, really blessed to get to make music with those folks, and they all became lifelong friends. They still are. I've been on several of Charlie McCoy's records. He's been on some of our records, and we socialize really frequently. And unfortunately, you know, I've gotten a lot older, so those people have aged out, and a lot of them are no longer with us. But
right,
it was great to be here at that time and get get to work with those people and get to know them.
Right. The one thing about your playing, Tim, that is remarkable to me, and it's not always the case with bass players, but when you play a country song, you feel like a country bassist, like a purist. And when you play a jazz song, you sound and feel like you're a jazz artist. And then when you play a rock song, you sound like a rock bassist. I mean, you're very true to the music, and it's not always the case with bass players.
Well, thank you. And that probably, I read that to my brother and to my mother. That's probably the greatest compliment that anybody has ever given me, because that was my goal. I would not have wanted somebody to say, well, he sounds like a jazz player trying to play on a Vince Gill record, or he sounds like a country guy trying to play, with Bill Evans. It was never that. I just wanted to be a bass player. One of the things that I taught my students when I was teaching at Miami was, I said, if you had to have a business card printed up and you could only put one word other than your name, what would you do? And they were like, what do you mean? I said, if you put down jazz, or two words, if you put down jazz bassist, think about how limiting your world's going to be, or country bassist. My father was funny. He had business cards made one time, and he just put down entertainer. And I thought, gosh, that's so good.
That is good. That's really good.
So I never wanted to be put in a box and just be one thing. The other thing is, I love all kinds of music. I did an interview with one of the bass magazines, and they said, well, who's your favorite bass player? And I was like, you can't do that to me. I said, the guy that I emulated maybe more than Jocko was a guy named Jimmy Haslip, who was a bass player in the Yellow Jackets, but also he played on the Gino Vanelli Brother to Brother record, and he played this remarkable groove, and then he had 4 little 2-measure solo breaks, which warped me. They were just brilliant, and I thought, cool, he's a great groove player, and he can solo like Jocko and groove like Louis Johnson, and he can do all these things, and that's what I want to be. I want to be the guy that could do that. Plus, where I've got one over on Jimmy is, I think Jimmy would probably be lost if you brought him in and said, well, we want you to play on a Gene Watson record, or we want you to play on a George Hamilton IV record. He would have no concept of that music that came along, and because and then he'd have one over me, of course, probably with Latin music. But I've just listened to a lot of stuff. I've absorbed it. I'm the youngest of 4 kids. I have a brother that's 3 years older than me, then 2 older sisters. And my older sisters were huge soul music fans, R&B music fans. So in our house, if my mother was playing music, it might be Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto, and my dad would come in and have me copying the lyrics off of some Homer and Jethro novelty song, and my sisters would be listening to Wilson Pickett or Aretha Franklin or James Brown. And I just loved the music where I could hear the bass player.
Right, sure.
It was only in later years, John, that I really came to love the Beatles as much, because I didn't particularly... Well, I wasn't knocked out with Paul McCartney's bass parts on the Beatle records.
Right.
I thought the songs were brilliant and the singing was brilliant, but I thought the bass parts were just okay compared to the bass parts you might hear on I Heard It Through the Grapevine, or What's Going On, or those things. So I never got to meet James Jamerson. I was able to talk to his son one time, and I told him, I said, your dad changed my life. And he just said, well, you're one of thousands of people that have sent that message to me.
I'm sure.
But I just wanted to be the right guy for everybody. I knew that there was going to be, when Victor Wooten came along, everybody's like, are you going to try to learn all that stuff? I said, no. Why do I do that? Victor is better at that than I am.
Right.
So I'm just going to be his friend and be his fan and appreciate that, because he checks boxes that I don't check. But I just had to know that I also check boxes that he didn't check.
Right. Well, you know this better than I do, Tim, but tone comes from the fingers and from the soul of the individual player. And I know bass players that if they're not the best guy in the room, they can't walk in the room because they'll hyperventilate out of insecurity.
Yeah, it's if your ego is driven to where you've got to be the coolest guy in the room, then you're doomed with it.
Yep.
You better just be able to be. I love being fans of other bass players. When David Hungate moved to Nashville, he moved here right after Toto 4 came out, and I had been a fan of his even before he was in Toto, but. With the Toto records, the first 4 Toto records were life-changing for me and my music. And he moved here, and I thought, I don't know if I should even stay in Nashville because who's going to call me? I do all the same things David does. He's just got a bigger resume than I've got.
Right.
And, later on, I actually hired him to come play on a Boots Randolph record because I just wanted to sit in the booth and enjoy it and hang, and we're great friends. The list of people I know that you've interviewed is really stellar and wonderful. But there's so many bass players, that are good friends of mine. Gary Lunge, who just had a birthday 2 days ago. He's a great friend, and we all competed for sessions and for opportunities.
Yep.
But I just always looked at it as if there's only enough work for 3 people here, then I need to get another job.
Right. Okay, so at what point then did you meet Joe English?
I first met Joe English in 1978, and he was playing in a band called Sea Level.
Cool.
He had left Paul McCartney in Wings. He had some serious drug issues in England and came back to America to get himself together, and he ended up living in Macon, Georgia. He got a gig with a band called Sea Level, which was 3 of the guys that had been in the Allman Brothers.
Oh, wow.
And they asked Joe to play drums with them.
Cool.
And I was a student at the University of Miami then, and in the jazz department. And Sea Level came to play at the University of Miami.
Oh, cool.
And I knew Chuck Leavell, the piano player, and I knew Lamar Williams, the bass player. So they invited me to hang with them, and I'd never met Joe English. I knew that he'd played with Paul McCartney. But we ended up going into this the courtyard of the hotel they stayed at near the university, and Joe and I were throwing a football around, and just got to know each other a little bit, and it was friendly. He was a great drummer, nice guy, and but he was definitely pretty messed up. The next time I saw Joe was in 1980, and it's so strange. I turned on. There was a late night TV show in Nashville then called Miller and Company. Dan Miller was a great newscaster, and he hosted this show, and his guest that night was Joe English. And I thought, I wonder if it could be the same Joe English. So I watched the show, and Joe had cut his hair and cleaned up and was dressed well and was talking about this accident that had happened to his wife, Dale, and how through her healing he had found his way to the Lord and gotten saved, and that he had recorded a Christian record, and he'd moved to Nashville. And I thought, that's amazing. I can't wait. I hope I run into him. The very next day, I'm at the Musicians Union picking up a check, and Joe English walks in.
No way.
So I reintroduced myself to him.
Oh, my gosh.
And I said, and he was telling me about his band, and I said, well, I guess have you already got your band together? He goes, yeah. He said, I wish I'd known you were here. And he said, give me your phone number. So I gave him my phone number.
Oh, wow.
And later that day, he called me.
No way.
And he said, let's get together and play. So he and I and the guy that played and wrote a lot of the songs in his first couple of records, John Rosasco, the 3 of us got together and played. And Joe, we grooved together great from the first minute. It was amazing. And then later that night, Joe called me, so I'd like for you to be in the band. I said, well, I thought you had a bass player. He goes, I do, but I'm going to have him switch to guitar. And that was Paul Brannon. So the original band with George Caccini, Paul Brannon, me, Joe, and John Lowry was born. And within a few weeks, we started rehearsing and getting ready to go out and do our first shows.
Oh, my gosh. It's so quick. I can't imagine. I got 2 things going through my head. One, what were the shows like? Did you guys gel pretty quickly as a band? And 2, was Joe propped up like some spiritual achievement award winner?
So the band, we meshed immediately. It was incredible. And we got to the first concert, and it came time for Joe to give a testimony kind of thing. And he didn't know any scripture. He didn't really know other than to tell about his wife's testimony, essentially.
Right. Well, it always bothered me for Joe and for like B.J. Thomas. He's saved, and 5 minutes later, he's doing Christian albums, and promoters are capitalizing on his popularity, and record labels are selling records and capitalizing on his name, and the poor guy hasn't had a chance to grow or anything. What was it like for you to stand there? What were you thinking as this stuff happened in front of you?
I thought, this guy he's going to get killed.
It's just sad.
And it's just like you said with B.J. Thomas. Same thing happened to Bob Dylan when he came out with his Christian record. The Christian record companies were so desperate to create a little version of the pop business, the rock and roll business, that if somebody came from that rock side, they would just seize on it.
Sad.
And the label we were on, that's what they were all about. They got Bonnie Bramlett, who I still work with to this day. She worked with us. Same thing. She grew up she had quite a tumultuous life. She always knew the Lord. She would go through periods of drifting way away from it. But with Joe, he didn't have any idea how to answer anybody's questions. All he could really say was what had happened to his wife. But for him, he didn't have that personal relationship yet. And it made me so angry because we would go do these concerts and the preacher would turn to Joe and say, well, Joe, why don't you lead us in an invitation?
Oh, man.
And Joe would be like, oh, my gosh, what do I do now? And I know he wanted to do well, but the business just swallowed him whole. And we switched record companies. We did, but the truth is, all those labels back then were the exact same thing. They were, I don't want to be mean, but it was wannabes of being in the pop business.
Right.
We even had, people come to us on the production side and say, we'd like for you to do a song that sounds like Foreigner, and then we want you to do a song that sounds like Gino Vanelli, and then we want you to do a song that sounds like Toto. When Toto 4 came out and won all those Grammys, okay, we want y'all to do a Toto kind of record. So I had issues with it. I was just proud to be in a band that was that great.
Right.
And I was proud to be able to go out and witness. Without me being a lead singer, my witness was always going to be my bass playing. And maybe at the end of the day, instead of having 200 people line up to ask for my autograph, I might have 6 or 7 bass players come up and go like, oh, man, tell me how you got where you are.
Right.
And that gave me my chance to be a witness
and actually pour into them a little bit.
But that was really the gist of it. And Joe and I were together for the better part of 4 years. That I left Joe. I played a little bit with Bill Gaither and the Gaither vocal band, and then I went 180 degrees and joined Mel Tillis, the country music singer. Who
I love Mel Tillis.
Had a crazy reputation. The band had a crazy reputation, and it was always great music, but it was definitely 180 degrees from being a ministry.
Right.
And, then the journey just sort of got real skewed at that point. I mean, the records, I don't know if you went through this too, but the records that I loved, I played on a lot of records in Nashville, and I've gone back through some of those. I just got a turntable.
Cool.
And the only records I still had were records I played on. And I started going back through these records and going like,
that's awesome.
I don't really like that. The records that I loved were all coming out of Los Angeles. So in 85, I just picked up and moved to L.A. And Dan Huff had moved out there, and we knew some other people, common people, and I had a couple of great years out there, and then a year that was really, the bottom sort of dropped out. And then I came back to the Carolinas and formed a jazz group with my brother, Roddy, and that led to like I said, the Keith Dudley work that we did, and I still toured. Joe and I got back. Joe actually moved to North Carolina then. Awesome. We got back together and toured one last tour together, and it was really tough. But then we ended up getting an offer to move to Paris and be the opening crew for Disneyland Paris.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
And at the end of that run, I was going to move back to Los Angeles, and all the people I called in Los Angeles, their phone numbers had been changed to Nashville area code numbers. So I was like, oh, I get it. So made the move back to Nashville, and that was a great move for me was to come back. And
so what year would that have been that you moved back?
I moved back to Nashville in 95.
Cool.
And I had made a bunch of money in Paris, and when my money started running out, I went to a club over near Opryland, a theater called the Stardust Theater, to see Boots Randolph, the famous saxophone player. Mm-hmm. I'd played on one of his records. In fact, I played on his last record that was on Monument Records. And we talked, and the next day he called and said, "Hey, can you come do the gig tonight?" And I said, "Yeah, what's up?" He said, "Well, I have three bass players, one that does Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, one that does Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and one that does the road gigs." So I went and sight read the gig, did it, had a great time. And at the end of that, he said, "Well, would you like to do the gig?" I said, "I don't want to do it unless I can do all of them." So he fired the other two guys, hired me, and that became one of the greatest relationships of my life. I ended up producing 4 records on Boots, and we just had a great run. He was the ultimate good boss to work for. I mean, every gig was a first-class gig. He was 30 years older than me. He shamed me every night by how great he played. And I was sitting there going, how do I keep up with this guy? And we toured all over the world. We played, he loved to ski too, so we would book Utah and Colorado in the winter, and we would go out and barely break even. We would make enough money to pay for our skiing habit for a couple of weeks. But he was a great guy, and we did a great gospel record with him too, called Songs for the Spirit that I'm really proud of. But, I had a really interesting encounter early on in the Joe English Band days. I had done a record with the Muscle Shoals Horns, and somebody was writing an article, I guess, for CCM magazine, and they interviewed me, and they said, "Well, how do you feel about going over to the dark side and playing secular music?"
Oh, geez.
And it upset me so much that I didn't know how to answer, and all I could think about was this thing that my dad had told me one time when I was a kid. Because they did both. They did gospel music. They were very successful in that, and they also were successful in every other kind of music. And
right.
And he said, "If you're a plumber, do you only plumb churches?" And so that's the point I made. He goes, "Well, don't you feel like, it's those people were probably drinking?" I said, "Well, I bet they were too." I said, "That I wasn't, and that's not what it was about. God gave me a gift as a musician." Right. As a bass player.
Right.
And all I know is those people are still my friends, the ones that are still alive to this day, and they still respect the fact that I was who I was,
right,
and I behaved the way that I behaved.
Right. Well, the judgment of Christ that we often like to bestow on his behalf to others that we don't approve of is a slippery slope, because the reality is that's the kind of judgment that keeps our neighbors from wanting to go to church with us at any point.
It's, I guess, I do believe that if I see a sin in somebody else, I'm aware of it, but I always come back to that two different things. One is get that log out of your own eye,
right,
before you do it. And the other was, I used to hear black preachers used to have, a lot of them had this thing, phrase they would use is sweep around your own doorstep.
Right.
And it was like, oh my gosh, if I tell somebody they're doing something wrong,
yep,
and I'm doing 100 things a day wrong, what kind of exposure? So
yep.
I think that we can, agree that, I'm doing my best to be closer to God and to avoid sin.
Yep.
As a human being, I'm going to fail at that every single day.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the next day I'm not going to get up and keep trying. And one of my good friends in Miami asked me, he said, "What do you pray about?" I said, "Well, I have a long list of people that I pray for every single day." I said, "But my most common prayer is, God, help me to be a better person tomorrow than I was today.
Right.
A better brother, a better son, a better uncle, a better friend, a better coworker, all those things." And you keep chasing that.
Yep.
With the knowledge that you aren't going to win that race. You've won the totality of the race, but every day we're going to, there's going to be some point. If we got in bed at night and then counted up the mistakes we made during the day, it would make for some really sleepless nights. That's why I'm always so quick to thank God for grace and mercy and forgiveness and
absolutely the righteousness of Christ.
Yeah, without that, oh my goodness, it's a frightening thing, but
right. Hey, I want to transition to this. I want to go deep into the Joe English Band. And as a bass player, it was always fascinating for me to watch you guys, but it was always fascinating to listen to Joe and watch him play. As a bass player, the first time you played with Joe, did you know he was different as a drummer than most of the other drummers on the planet?
Well, you have to go back to why did Paul McCartney hire Joe English?
Okay.
Joe was playing. He was, as his testimony, and it's very true. He was living in the back of a 1964 Dodge Dart. He was shoveling manure on a farm that the Allman Brothers owned, and he was playing he'd played in a band from Rochester called Tall Dogs. Then he moved to Macon and was just sort of playing around the club some. And the trombone player from Tall Dogs had gotten the gig to write horn charts for Paul McCartney on a record he was doing in New Orleans. And their drummer, Jeff Britton, decided to leave. And I guess Paul came in the room and said, man, we got to get a drummer. And so Tony Dorsey was the trombone player's name. He just stood up and said, I got a guy. And so he called Macon. He got Joe on the phone and said, you got to get to New Orleans. And Joe thought it was a joke at first, but he got down there. But then I think the first song they started working on was Silly Love Songs. Well, if you listen to the drum part on Silly Love Songs, it's as much a part of that being a hit record as anything Paul did. So my gut feeling is when Paul played 32 measures with Joe English, played bass with Joe English for 32 measures, he realized he was in the presence of genius.
I would think so.
That's exactly how I felt. I had played with some great studio drummers, the top guys in Nashville, but by the point that Joe and I really started playing together, and he played very strange. He played the hi-hat with his left hand, but he was right-handed. And so his groove was very different than people that play cross-handed.
Right.
But his time was so spectacular that I felt like I was like, if you look at the groove being shaped like a wagon rut, with Joe, I could go anywhere I wanted to go. I could stay in the middle. I could go in front of the beat. I could go behind the beat. Joe just made it feel perfect all the time. So I knew then that I was playing with one of the best drummers in the world.
Just from the outside looking in, it feels that way when I listen to him play. I can't imagine getting to play with him. Oh my gosh.
Oh, it was unbelievable. And of course he was a great singer too.
Yep.
But I used to love when he would get to the point in the song where he would have sung everything and he'd push the microphone away and then you just see him change gears and he would go to Joe English, the drummer. And, a story, and I told Joe this later, is that we were in England and Joe came to my hotel room and he said, let's take a walk. And so we ended up walking to Soho Square and walked in McCartney's office, and Linda was at the top of the stairs, and she said, we all go to the studio, he's working. So we went over to Air London to the studio and rode the elevator up. The studio was on the third floor, and the doors open, and Paul McCartney runs out and hugs Joe.
Oh my gosh.
And I looked at that like, okay. And they hadn't seen each other since Joe left the band.
Right.
And it was unbelievable, the love that he had in his eyes for Joe. And then Joe went over, and he was actually in the studio recording with Carl Perkins on a record called Tug of War. And Carl was a good friend of my family and friend of mine, and we talked. And Paul was just really, really nice. But then we got a chance just for Paul and I to be together for a moment.
Right.
And he said, Joe is the greatest drummer I ever played with. And on that session that I was at, he had Steve Gadd, who,
oh my gosh,
is probably one of the two greatest drummers that's ever been recorded.
Yep.
And Paul said that, and I just looked at him. I said, I know. And it wasn't that Joe was complex. He didn't have the chops that some of the jazz guys do, but the feel was so spectacular that he could play kick on 1 and 3, snare on 2 and 4, and 8th notes on the hi-hat. And it sounded like a number one record.
Yeah.
It didn't matter how bad the song was. Joe had that magic to do it. And Modern Drummer did an interview about Joe years later, and Jeff Porcaro, who was my drum hero and one of Joe's drum heroes, was on the cover of that issue. But when they interviewed Joe and they interviewed me on that, and they said, what is it that Joe does? And I said, well, all I can think about is that he was blessed with such an incredibly wonderful internal metronome that when he plays, it just inspires everybody else. And our band, the Joe English band, everybody was a great player.
Right.
They were all really special musicians. And so when we played, so much of it, John, was effortless.
Right.
Because, just to play along with that drummer like that. And But yeah, that was I knew from the first minute, and I've been lucky enough that the drummer I'm playing with now on my band's music is Keith Carlock, who's the drummer for Steely Dan, who's been with Toto and everybody else, and it's the same thing. I mean, he is when he plays, it just feels like you've died and gone to heaven, and there's nothing can go wrong while he's playing, and there's very few people that can do that, and I've been blessed to play with several of them. And
right, I got to tell you this. I remember I loved Joe's first album. I loved the songs. I loved his voice. I loved the flow of the album. Just everything about it was just beautiful.
Yeah.
But I remember the day I put on Held Accountable for the very first time, and it was like, oh my gosh, Jaco Pastorius has joined the Joe English Band. It was like the musicianship on that album was like 3 clicks up, straight up. And I got to say, Press On and Held Accountable are 2 of my favorite all-time Christian albums, not only for the songs and for Joe's voice, but for the band. You guys were just stellar on those albums, just amazing.
Yeah, it's funny. Held Accountable was, there was a tune on there called The Best Is Yet to Come, which we were told they wanted us to sound like Foreigners, feels like the first time. And, the way that they wrote tunes, the only tune that I wrote on that record was an instrumental called "Thief in the Night," but
which, by the way, is stunningly cool.
Well, I still listen to that every once in a while. It was fun to do that. We definitely had some demons shouted out of us at a couple of churches when we played that, but we played it anyway, John. But
right.
But you're right. I mean, that record, we actually went in the studio as a band. We'd been on the road for about 9 months, so we were very tight. We came in and played, and Lights in the World, the first record, was, of course, great players again, but it was definitely a studio record. It was,
right.
Joe told me one time that all he did is walked in and played and sang the songs. He had no input on anything else that was going on there. They had hired an arranger and producer, and they just, made the record, and Joe was plug in the Christian artist here.
Right.
But Held Accountable was really a band record, and Press On even more. Press On was more of the band taking over some of the production of the record, and everybody in the band ended up writing for that record.
So when it came time to go in and record, how much time did you guys spend before you went in the studio, like working out arrangements and songs?
Well, on Held Accountable, we the record company that Joe was on had leased one of the studios in town every night from like midnight to 6.
Okay.
So we went in a few times, and we would work for, doing somebody else's record, and we'd mess around with some of our own stuff. But for the most part, what I remember is we basically, at sound check of a gig, we would work up a new idea. You talk about Jeff Gallup.
He's awesome.
He's one of my heroes. But Paul Brannon, who was the guitar player in that band, one of the 2 guitar players, had a basement. He lived out east of town, had a basement with set up to rehearse in. So before our first tour, we rehearsed for about 20 days in the basement every day. And then before we did Held Accountable, I think we went back in the basement for a few days and hammered some things out. But
that's so cool.
We by a certain point, we could just sort of read each other's minds, and everybody knew what to do. We had 2 great guitar players with George Caccini and Paul Brannon, and they really found where they needed to fit, and then John Lowry was, great organ player, great synth player, and it just,
right.
We found each other real fast, and I just figured that you mentioned the Jaco thing. That's so funny because at some point in every song, I wanted people to know it was Tim Smith.
Right.
So I would play whatever I thought the song needed, and then sometimes on the fade out, I'd be like, "Hey, here we go. I got 10 seconds."
Oh, that's great.
I'm really, really so grateful that I got to do those records with Joe because it's
oh man, yeah,
it's certainly a part of the history of our industry. One of the top musicians in Nashville is a drummer named Scott Williamson. I don't know if you know Scott.
Oh yeah, yep.
Brilliant musician, great arranger, great producer. And, he told me the first time I played with him, he goes, "Man, I remember seeing you when I was 13 years old, and you guys played with Joe at Estes Park, Colorado, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing." And every time I hear that, it's like, well, that is so good that people were listening, and it made an impact because We never sought out to just be a great Christian band. We just wanted to be Christian men who were great musicians and made great music.
Hey Rockstar provides digital marketing software and services for your church to generate more interest, create more exposure, and reach more people. Let Hey Rockstar amplify the awesomeness of your ministry. And, as always, Hey Rockstar is a proud sponsor of the Stage Right with John Thorne podcast.
Thanks for tuning in today. Thank you, Hey Rockstar. My special thanks to Tim Smith for being my guest. Don't forget, next Friday, 12 noon, part 2 of my conversation with Tim. Have a great weekend, everyone.